You're training for strength. RPE 6, RPE 8, RPE 10. Does it even matter? Soon to be Dr. Milo Wolf from Wolf Coaching here. Today, we're discussing the relationship between RPE, or how close to failure you're training, and your strength improvements. Before we get into the video, let me give you a very quick primer in less than 30 seconds on what RPE and reps in reserve is. Reps in reserve just describes how many more repetitions at the end of a set you think you could have done before reaching failure. RPE is kind of the opposite of that. So essentially, you would just subtract RIR. For example, let's say you could have done 2 more reps from 10, and that would be your RPE rating from 0 to 10. So an RPE of 8 would be a reps in reserve 2. And so forth. Let's dive into the findings from this meta-analysis by Zach Robinson and colleagues. By the way, Zach is awesome. Give him a follow if you don't already. When combining all the findings from about 25 studies into one aggregate finding, it looks like overall, how close to failure you train and what RPE you train to doesn't really seem to influence how much strength you gain at all. If anything, contrary to what some people have been preaching and saying for years, that training close to failure is really important for strength adaptations because you're trying to improve maximum strength, so specificity and how close to failure you train is important. It seems like actually the benefits for strength that you see are a bit worse closer to failure compared to a bit more submaximally, closer to say 3 to 5 reps in reserve or RPE 5 to 7. So if RPE doesn't really matter for strength, what do we do? There are a few considerations. The first one I want to touch on is the distinction between repetition-mediated changes in RPE and load-mediated changes in RPE. During a discussion with Zach Robinson, the author of this paper, what we got into was kind of the difference between training with more weight versus performing more repetitions and how that influences RPE, and whether there's a difference in how much strength you would get from either approach, either using more weight versus performing more repetitions at the same weight, and whether there's really a difference between how those two would influence strength adaptations. What it looks like is that there's a pretty consistent relationship between how much weight you're lifting and the improvements in maximum strength that you see. In other words, specificity does seem to apply in terms of how heavy you should be lifting. If you're a powerlifter trying to improve your 1 rep max on the squat, bench, deadlift, and you're not training heavy, and by heavy I mean 80+% of your max pretty frequently, likely there's something you're missing out on. If by going closer to failure, this allows you to use more weight on the bar and a greater percentage of your max, that's likely positive for strength than if you used less weight and had a lower RPE. However, if you went to a higher RPE by just doing more repetitions per set, but using the same weight, that generally wouldn't lead to greater strength adaptations. In other words, much more so than being mediated by how close to failure you train, strength adaptations may more so be mediated by how heavy are you lifting? Well, let me give you an example in less than 30 seconds to break down how this would work in practice. Let's say, for example, with 85% of your max, we know you can do 8 repetitions. You're doing a set with 5 repetitions at 85% of your max. In other words, that's an RPE 7 set, 3 more reps in a tank. There's 2 ways you could increase RPE here. Either by doing more reps, up to 3 more reps, pushing that set up to RPE 10, or by doing more weight. For example, 90% of your max for 5 repetitions, which could also push the RPE up to 10. The former example, where you're doing more reps but not changing the weight, that change likely wouldn't result in more strength adaptations. On the other hand, lifting more weight on the bar, that would result in greater strength adaptations. So when an RPE change is driven by an increase in load on the bar, that will result in more strength adaptations in all likelihood. On the other hand, if an RPE change is driven by an increase in repetitions per set, but no change in weight, in all likelihood, that's not going to help you gain more strength. It may actually be slightly worse due to more fatigue and so forth. In other words, for a strength program, your focus should be on lifting heavy, but not lifting close to failure necessarily. The trade-off between how much additional fatigue you get from lifting closer to failure versus how much additional weight you're able to lift is something you need to consider. But don't just train closer to failure for the sake of it, doing sets of 5 or more reps. If you're trying to be specific, lift heavy weights for low reps, and RPE ideally would still be relatively low. For example, a single at RPE 7 with, say, 90% of your max is likely going to produce about as much strength improvement as a triple at 90% at about RPE 9, 9.5. Because in this example, you're just doing more reps and that's the only thing pushing the RPE up. So train heavy. In terms of RPE, train relatively submaximally, and that's kind of the key for strength adaptations, right? Well, there's one more consideration. For strength sports like powerlifting, for example, hypertrophy is likely relatively important. We also need to consider how does RPE and how close to failure you train influence hypertrophy. As we reviewed in this video right here, it looks like the closer to failure you train for hypertrophy, the more hypertrophy you see. In other words, there's kind of a disconnect between how training closer to failure influences strength adaptations versus how it influences hypertrophy adaptations. Importantly though, for relatively low scale movements like the squat, the bench, the deadlift, hypertrophy improvements or increases in muscle size, getting bigger, is likely going to contribute to getting stronger as well. So how do you balance these two considerations? On the one hand, training submaximally seems better for strength, provided you're lifting pretty heavy. On the other hand, you kind of want to lift maximally or closer to failure for hypertrophy, and you need some hypertrophy to optimize strength. Well, I think that's where training in the off season and non-specific training comes in. Further into the off season, when you're not close to a competition and you're not really trying to maximize one repetition maximum strength right then and there, that's where training closer to failure in a lighter rep range really comes in clutch. So what I would say is, when you're say more than about 3 months out from a competition, including some more maximal training, say closer to RPEs of 8 to 10, or within about 2 reps of failure, that's going to be beneficial for increasing muscle size and thus in the long term increasing your strength as well. Then the closer you get to a competition, the more submaximal your training should generally be, while still trying to maximize how much weight is on the bar for any given set. Generally that will come via reducing the amount of reps you do per set rather than pushing the RPE way up. This is because, as I mentioned, pushing the RPE up inherently doesn't seem to improve strength adaptations. So just make sure that when you're increasing the load on the bar, you're also reducing the repetitions so that RPE stays in a reasonable place and you don't get the additional, likely excessive fatigue that comes from pushing close to failure too often, especially for strength, where again, you don't see a benefit of doing so. So here are my practical recommendations for RPE, or how close to failure you should train for strength. When you're in the off season, most of your training should likely be pretty hypertrophy orientated. So when you're about more than 3 to 4 months out from a competition, a lot of your training should take place pretty close to failure. So within about 2 reps of failure, all the way to failure sometimes, especially on accessory movements that aren't quite as specific to your main lift. Then, as you gradually move closer to competition, most of your training should reduce in terms of RPE. So you should probably train mostly between RPEs of 5 and 7, but you should still be trying to maximize the load on the bar. The way you accomplish that is by generally performing a lot of lower repetition sets, say sets of about 1 to 3, but keeping RPEs between about 5 and 7 for the most part, with potentially some higher RPEs very close to a competition, just in order to get a feel for what your capabilities might be and for you to be able to select openers for meet day or just see where your strength is at a bit more accurately. Anyways, that's the video. If you like the video, please comment, like, subscribe. If there's anything you want to see, leave a comment down below and I'll get to that as well. More videos coming every Wednesday and Saturday, now until the end of time, or until they don't pay my bills and I'm homeless and I can't make videos anymore. Probably about 2 weeks. In any case, enjoy your week and I will see you in that next video. Peace.